Sheath exists to expose and dismantle the cultural and commercial drivers of sexual exploitation. One of the many areas that we look at is the impact that online pornography has on offline actions and behaviours, which is why we are talking about escalation pathways tonight. And if we do say so ourselves, there is no one better than Michael Sheath to talk about the role that freely available pornography plays in the journey of some men from pornography user to child sex offender, given his years and years of experience working in this area. Just to give you a trigger warning before we begin, there will be mentions of child sexual abuse, sexual assault, rape, and incest. There will be explicit language used in some examples, but no explicit images will be shown whatsoever. We know that this is going to be really difficult and really upsetting content. But unfortunately, it is the reality of what we are fighting against. But if at any point you feel upset or you can't continue listening, please just feel free to leave the webinar or walk away and come back to it and do whatever you need to do to keep yourselves safe. As Michael presents, please do feel free to write any questions in the chat and then we will get to them afterwards. So, Michael, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm here, I think, because I suppose of my experience. I used to be an expert witness, and an expert witness was defined by their experience and qualifications. I worked as a probation officer for 10 years, just about, in prisons and in the community. And then I worked for the Lucy Faithfull Foundation / Stop It Now UK for 25 and a half years. The last half was the most difficult, working as an expert witness in the family courts and also in the clinic we used to run at Wolvercote till 2002. I also managed the helpline on occasions, and I trained police officers and social workers in this subject, really. Now I do all sorts of things, but most relevant to this is I work for Europol on the COSEC course, which is the annual course for police officers from around Europe in understanding the behaviour of persons committing offences in the online environment. So I want to take us back to some ancient history, which is 2002, although Al Cooper, not the soul singer, was writing from about 97, 98. We all love acronym type things. Cooper was looking at the growth of online pornography in the digital age, not child abuse material, but what he said is relevant today. And what Cooper says is there are three drivers, he calls it an engine, three drivers for the phenomenal growth of pornography in the online environment from about 97, 98. Affordability, it's free or cheap. Availability, there is anything you can conceivably imagine is available, again, for free in the main. And I think the most important notion is anonymity. People who believe they are anonymous and cannot be seen and are therefore not responsible, don't feel responsible for their conduct, will behave much more badly, reprehensibly, than people who are in plain sight. So this morning, I was thinking about how to convey the more modern notion of this, and I came up with the 4 I's. I'm quite happy with that. Inhibition, or really disinhibition, impediment, or really the absence of impediment, ideology, and influences. And by inhibition, I mean the removal of things that prevent us internally. I am inhibited from murder because I think murder is wrong, and so on. So most of us are inhibited from doing bad things by ourselves. We prevent ourselves from doing bad things. I will talk in a moment about drivers, which are kind of the mental process that affects people viewing both pornography and child abuse material. Impediments used to be to pornography, and certainly to child abuse material, used to be primarily cost. Pornography was expensive before the internet. DVDs were £9.99. If you wanted to watch a huge volume of pornography, you had to spend a huge amount of money. Now you can spend no money. So there's a kind of ubiquitous availability of free pornography, and just as much, by the same token, the ubiquitous availability of child abuse material. It's typically 3 or 4 clicks away from the average person. I'll also talk about ideology, what's in the minds of the viewer of child abuse material, what's in the minds of the person who abuses children in a sexual way, and also what's in the minds of the viewer of pornography, and how does pornography shift one's mind, shift one's ideas about what's right, what's wrong, what's desirable, and so forth. And I won't talk much about influencers, but I'll mention a fantastic article called Anyone Want to Go, which is a horrible title, but it comes from a horrible criminal trial where a woman was sexually engaged by a football player, and he sent a WhatsApp message to all his friends saying, anyone want to go? And the connection in the article is that this is the language and these are the behaviors that are absolutely commonplace in mainstream pornography, that essentially women are endlessly available for men to perform sexual acts upon them. The trial ended in a not guilty plea, but the behavior was accepted. It was accepted that these things were said and that some things went on. So if you think about any crime, if you think about any crime such as burglary or car theft, they all occur because the balance between inhibition and disinhibition, should I do this, shouldn't I do this, and the opportunity, the availability of the target, if you like, versus what protects the target once those things shift. And it's my view really that the internet is absolutely laden with disinhibition and absolutely laden with opportunity. There's a universe of opportunity available for sexual crime on the internet in terms of child abuse material, soliciting children for sexual purposes, grooming and so forth, but also people engage online in a disinhibited way. And some of those disinhibitions are innate, but some of them I think are environmental, and they have a connection with the way viewing pornography and being anonymous impinge upon one's capacity to make decisions or influence one's decisions. So there are three drivers really. I mentioned drivers earlier, and there are three drivers that I used to talk to the men I saw about. I probably interviewed 300, 400 men who'd been in possession of child abuse material and had been caught for doing so. And most of them professed to having no real understanding of what they had done. Many of them admitted that there was a kind of sexual component to their behavior, but they didn't understand how they had got from A to B. The vast majority of them, and this was proven, if you like, by the forensic examination of their computers, the vast majority of them were heavy pornography users, heavy mainstream pornography users, and their possession of child abuse material was part of that behavior. Very few I met started looking at child abuse material, and they were unambiguously paedophilic. The majority of the men I met could not be diagnosed as paedophiles. They were ordinary men, as we might say. They were men who were in possession of child abuse material, had to face the consequences of that. But when you looked at the origins of their conduct, it wasn't necessarily in relation to unambiguous sexual desire for children. So we have three drivers we've identified. One is called the bikini effect, and it's most often used by advertisers. When advertisers want to sell things to men, they often use glamour and sex and the kind of representations of women. There's thousands of adverts I could point to about that. But in terms of the brain chemistry, sexual arousal, however created, does seem to create generic impulsivity, not just about sex, but about issues around spending and buying and so forth. But it also feeds a desire for instant gratification. People want things now, and they're not prepared to wait. So they kind of discount the future. They discount the possibility of arrest, and they discount the possibility of shame and divorce and being sacked from their job and so on, because they're concerned about what's immediately in front of them. And that is something that's sexually desirable. The other aspect is about empathy. Empathy appears to be reduced in persons who are experiencing sexual arousal. They are less capable of feeling for the other person. And of course, that's hugely connected to sexual crime, because if we don't care about someone, whether we know them or not, we're more likely to be in a position to be capable of exploiting or abusing them. The Coolidge effect is about the brain's desire for novelty in terms of arousal. And what we call habituation is where people get sick of seeing the same thing. Now, many of the men I would speak to would say they were on a pornography site, they see lots of pornography, they see all sorts of pornography going all through the catalogues, but eventually it doesn't work for them and they need to find something else if they want to maintain their level of arousal. So they look at the teen sites and they look at the legal teen sites and they look at the fake sites, and they ultimately are looking at unambiguously abusive imagery. Their empathy's down because of the bikini effect. All these things connect. And the final notion is what we'll call the slot machine effect, sometimes called the Skinner box effect. And it's essentially a behavioral trait where people are driven to look for where random reinforcement is extraordinarily powerful. So people find images occasionally that are extraordinarily powerful and desirable for them, and they find a lot of other imagery not terribly interesting or upsetting or boring and so on. So they keep searching and they maintain that hunger. They keep pulling the lever, essentially. And when you find a man who has 500,000 images in his possession, 500,000 is not uncommon now, it's inconceivable that he can have a meaningful relationship or experience of each of those images. There's too many of them. So the bulk of images are not viewed in the way that we imagine. They're collected, found to be undesirable or uninteresting, and simply deleted or put to one side. So those three drivers are not known to most viewers. They don't know this stuff exists. It's often quite eye-opening to have a conversation with them to say, have you heard of these things? And the vast majority of men I dealt with had never heard of these things and were unaware that they existed. Why do we object to child abuse material or child exploitation material? What are the roots of that? Well, of course, there are two issues. One is that child sexual exploitation material is created through the sexual abuse of children. Sexual abuse of children is wrong, is harmful, should not occur, etc. So we take a moral stance to say children shouldn't be sexually abused, of course, and while we're at it, children shouldn't be filmed while they're being sexually abused. CSEM is the product of child sexual exploitation. This is an old Interpol definition. I couldn't track it down, but I was aware of it from the late 90s. And there are some really interesting words in here. Interpol defines it as any means of depicting, showing, or promoting the sexual abuse of a child. So there's those twin notions. To the viewer, it says, here is a child being sexually abused. But there's also an ideological underpinning to that, which kind of says, and this is desirable, and this is okay, and you should look more. And if you go on the sites where people are collecting this material, that's the language that they're engaging in. I want to see more. I want to see more interesting things. I want to see more of that child. I want to see more like this. What else have you got? And these individuals have conversations with each other that have a high degree of ideology in them, which I will come to in a moment. The issue for us in terms of CEASE's campaigning is, well, what's mainstream pornography got to do with child abuse material? Is it not the case that if we drew a Venn diagram, we would have over here mainstream pornography, which is in adult entertainment and enhances the gaiety of the nation, and over here we have child sexual abuse material, which is wrong and reprehensible and exploitative. Is it not possible that there's a kind of ideological overlap between those two notions? If you found a loved one or someone you were working with, a client, or if you're a police officer online, if you found someone had in their possession a number of films that had titles like these, I'll just read a couple of them: boyfriend forced girlfriend for sex, and daddy keeps effing daughter till she likes it, you would imagine that person had a problem and that they were potentially dangerous to children and that they were also in possession of child abuse material. Now, it may disappoint you to know that all of these titles were found on mainstream pornography sites, that the barrier, the line between mainstream pornography and unambiguous exploitation of children or sexual exploitation of adults is far more blurry and nuanced than we believe. Now, these titles come from what I think is the finest piece of research about this subject in the last 10 years, Fiona Vera Gray. And what she and her other workers from the same university did was to look at the titles, didn't watch the videos, they looked at the titles of a number of mainstream legal pornography sites. Here we are, Pornhub, Xhamster, Xvideo. They looked at 131,738 titles, and they analysed the titles for language that comes from the World Health Organization definitions, categorizations of sexual violence. And what they did was they just arrived on the site. They didn't do any searching. They just scrolled down as long as they could and saw what came up. Now, just as a point of interest, this hasn't changed much, because I had a look on one of these sites this morning, and the five first things that came up, 3 of them were about sex with a stepchild or stepsister, and the other one, I can't remember the title, it was something like he can't wait till his best friend's daughter reaches 18, which is interesting. Anywho, here are the 4 categories. One is called sexual activity between family members, what we would casually refer to as incest. So incest content. The words auntie, daughter, dad, mom would appear in the title. And there's a typical title. When mom's mad, angry, dad goes to his daughter. This is an incest story, I would imagine. Second is aggression, violence, assault. The language there is grope, molest, kick, punch, choke, strangle, batter, etc. And here's one I hesitate to read out, but here you go. Meth whore wife throat effed and pounded by dealer. That doesn't seem to me to be very romantic. There we are. 3 is image-based voyeurism. Voyeurism in the UK is a crime, but the language there is hidden, spy, leaked, undercover, sneaky, that kind of language, as if it were filmed in a changing room or a toilet, and so forth. And there's our title, upskirted in the train, which again is a crime. But these aren't crimes, these are representations of crimes. 4th is coercive exploitative, where the language is around very young, innocent, schoolgirl, and also helpless, drunk, asleep, those kind of notions. It'll be teen girl, drunk, gets a good pounding. Sometimes you combine all the titles. And what they found was 12% of the total 130,000 titles were coded as including sexual violence. All of the sites were legal sites. So the issue is you can spend all your time on a legal site, but you can be looking at material that on the surface appears to represent violence against children, violence against women, incestuous content, and so forth. Most of these things you would be imprisoned for if you were to engage in them in the real world. Important here, and this is more and more important as time passes and more adolescent children pass through puberty. Before the expansion of pornography in the digital age, adolescents would not see huge volumes of pornography. They just simply wouldn't. And the erotic template is what drives our sexuality in adulthood. Here's the definition: constellation of thoughts, images, behaviors, sounds, etc. How we learn what sex is, how we learn what arousing is, and so on. And the erotic template develops in adolescence through experience and through ideas that come to us. So it comes hand in hand with ideological notions about gender role and consent and propriety and rights and duties and so forth. I think it's absolutely true that there isn't a generation in the modern age that has seen more sex than our current adolescent population. And those children are viewing this material from 10, 11, 12. Most children have a smartphone by the time they hit 10 or 11. Children are unambiguously using smartphones, unsupervised by their parents, to view pornography online. And the pornography they're viewing is not nice man and lady have a nice time. It's the material that I was just referring to that's found on commonplace, mainstream, respectable, inverted commas, pornography sites. Where does that take us? Well, it takes us to ideology. And when I was in probation, we used to give out questionnaires to the men that we were treating, and they would fill them in. And the questionnaires were looking for their deviant schema, the way that they see the world, how they understand sex, intimacy, children, women, rape, and so forth, their ideologies. Now, I'll pull out two of the schema. There are five that affect men who have been involved in child molestation, and two that affect men involved in rape. One overlaps. Entitlement is a trait. Sense of entitlement is a trait of men who commit sexual offences against children and against women, and it's essentially what you would look up, what you would see in the dictionary. So it's that sense of entitlement or right to do whatever you want to do, to be more important than other people. Men are more important than women. Men are more important than children. Sex is a right. Men and boys' needs have to be met, and if they're met by the exploitation or expression of cruelty towards another person, that's just tough. And also there's also a sense of entertainment, but also flight. So I work with men, as I did endlessly. So many of them would use that word. What were you doing online? I was escaping. I was in flight. And they use both pornography and child abuse material as a way of escaping from the mundanity or the powerlessness, as they see it, of their day-to-day life. And the second is more complex, but it's a kind of Hobbesian state of nature, really. The world is dangerous. Women are dangerous. Women are hostile. Women change their minds. Women are dishonest. Women reject you. And the only way to engage appropriately or effectively with women is to dominate them and use violence and use seduction if you can, and violence if you have to. And you will find this expressed by some famous influencers who earn a living out of expressing these kind of notions and who appear to be reasonably influential in terms of the ideology that boys are developing. So violence is a part of sex, and sex is essentially warfare between men and women and men and children. And it's really interesting when you look at the descriptions online of porn stars who people think have a glamorous existence, and children who are subject to child sexual exploitation. The language is very similar. They are both arousing and disgusting in the same breath. So they're treated with cruelty and a vicious sense of ownership, but they're also seen as quite desirable. So it's quite a complex mixture of desires. What are we doing about this? Well, interestingly, Pornhub/IWF, Internet Watch Foundation, and Stop It Now are running a chatbot. They started running it in about 2022. It was the last thing I did before I left the foundation, was to try and work out the language that we might use, that the chatbot would use, to invite people to come and talk to us. I'll talk to them now. So it had how many? 28,000 search terms that it would trigger. Child, 9, 8, 7, etc. 28,000 words that were connected to child sexual exploitation material. It was triggered 2,800,000 times, which is horrific over a 17-month period. What is amazing is that 2,800,000 is 0.2% of the Pornhub searches during that same period. So Pornhub would say, well, look, 99.8% of our searches did not trigger the chatbot, but nothing I mentioned earlier would trigger the chatbot either. So it's possible to stay on Pornhub and watch pretty abusive content without triggering the chatbot. Nonetheless, 2.8 million resulted in 1,656 engagements with the services and 68 calls to the helpline, where the caller said, I'm calling you because I saw the chatbot. Now, those numbers good. Are they good? I don't know. They're interesting. Let's call them interesting. But what happened to all the other people, all the other 2,799,000 who triggered the chatbot and did not click on the services? Why didn't they? I suspect it's to do with empathy. I suspect they were mildly inconvenienced, and I suspect they made searches elsewhere. It's not been researched. So, in terms of sexual crime against children, we are storing up some problems for ourselves through our boys, because their erotic template is being shaped by excessive exposure to pornography, and that pornography contains messages that are intrinsically abusive, exploitative, incest-laden, and so forth. And for the first time in history, we have a population, a cohort of boys, and to a lesser extent girls, whose sexuality is being shaped by mainstream pornographic norms around exploitation and so forth. No question, child abuse material is child abuse film. That's it. There will be no solutions coming from AI. Occasionally people say, oh, what if we had AI, artificial intelligence, child abuse material, doesn't have any children in it. That's not exploiting children, is it? Well, yes, it is, because it's promoting the notion of children being sexual objects and ripe for exploitation, even if the child in the image doesn't actually exist. I think the underpinning ideology is exactly the same. I think it's fair to say that there's not a great gap, there's not a kind of vacuum between mainstream pornography and CSAM. Much of the content is implicitly the same, the ideology is the same as mainstream pornography. And mainstream pornography itself often depicts and promotes sexual violence. It's not adult entertainment as we would understand it. Pornographers are not our friends. And the only distinction I would make, which is important, is most people who don't take a strong view about mainstream pornography haven't seen mainstream pornography. It only takes 5 minutes on any of the popular sites for you to realize it's not what you imagine. It's not naked men and ladies having a nice time. It's laden with exploitation and abuse. For Another Day is the crossover between viewing pornography, viewing child sexual abuse material, and molesting children. But I would say that debate is extraordinarily complex because we have research that runs from 80% of men viewing child abuse material having or being likely to sexually abuse children to 4% of men answering that same question. The parameters for the research are so wide, we don't have meaningful answers yet. But the best place to start with, CSAM is child sexual exploitation. Children are harmed by it. Mainstream pornography does connect ideologically and mentally in terms of mental processes, disinhibition and so forth with child abuse material. And my time is up. I put what I think is an hilarious final slide, but I don't know. You may find it not hilarious. And I shall now exit and try to shut down the presentation so you can all see each other's faces. Bear with.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael.
Pleasure. Bear with.
No worries. Take your time.
Stop sharing. Don't click leave.
No, please don't click leave.
Have we stopped sharing?
Yes.
Hooray.
I have a little bit of feedback. Can we just make sure that everybody is muted, please? So thank you, Michael. That was, as always, a really informative but really tough presentation. It's always really difficult to hear about this. I've heard Michael speak many times, and I still learn something new, and I still come away feeling quite upset. So
apologies. As I said, you can't. It's impossible to describe it without describing it. You can't just say, "Oh, there's some really bad things." I try not to be gratuitous, but you can't just say it's really bad without reading out, without saying this is what's on there. And I think that is a societal problem. If you're not interested in pornography, you have no idea what's available, and it is quite a shocker. There we are.
Yeah, absolutely. You're 100% right. And we at Cease, this is why we are having this webinar. It's why we talk about this, because we really think that this is really important and that we have to speak about this and it has to be understood. And as you said, it is very complex, which is why it's so good that we can have your expertise. We will get to questions in about 2 minutes. And I know that there have been various different comments coming in the chat and different questions, so we will definitely get to them. To give you a little bit of context from Sheath's point of view, which I also think I forgot to introduce myself when we started. I am Head of Policy and Public Affairs with Sheath, and I do a lot of our campaigning work, working with government, working with people like Michael, which is wonderful. And
Stop.
Michael has a dog in the background, as do I. So if you hear barking, apologies. We are really concerned about what Michael has raised tonight and the types of content that he has outlined and the implications for both victims of child sexual abuse, as Michael has outlined. In child sexual abuse material and exploitation, there was always a victim. There was always a child that is being hurt. And we are also worried about the people who Michael has worked with, who are trapped in these spirals of needing to consume more and more extreme and often illegal content. And we couldn't agree more that pornography is harmful and that this is an industry that needs to be held to account for not just allowing this content, but actively promoting it and profiting from the sexualization of children. So, as many of you who follow Sheath will know, we have been calling on the government to regulate this type of material for some time. Obviously, we're in mid-election. Hopefully, we'll have a new government by the end of this week. But as it stands, there is currently a loophole in legislation that allows this content to be uploaded and shared online, and yet that same material is not allowed offline. So this is a big loophole that we are trying to close with Sheath. So in the offline world, it is illegal to sell a DVD or a Blu-ray that contains content that Michael has outlined. So any content that suggests sexual activity with children, content that depicts incest, and content which depicts the infliction of pain or acts which are likely to cause serious physical harm, whether real or in a sexual context simulated. But as we know, this content is prolific online, and there is nothing in the law to stop this from happening. So we have been advocating that if something is illegal offline, it should be illegal online. It's very simple. It was the premise of the UK government's Online Safety Act. If something is illegal offline, it needs to be illegal online. And in the case of this material that is sexualizing children, we believe that this is something that needs to be urgently fixed. So the last government began an independent review into the regulation of pornography in the UK, and we have repeatedly raised this issue with the review team, and we will continue to do that when the next government is in place. So I say this, well, number one, because we would love for you to join us in that campaign, and when we have a new government, to be calling on your MPs to make sure that this loophole is closed, but also to give you a little bit of hope that actually, people are aware of this. Myself, Sheath, Michael, lots of other people that we work with are working really hard to make sure that this content is no longer prohibited and that the porn industry is going to be held to account for allowing this material that is causing so much harm and damage. And with that, I believe we have some questions. So bear with me while I go through them. So this is a question from Tim. And Michael, I'm going to see what you think about this. How do we get legislators to pay attention to these facts?